This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This workshop is on getting started with pasture management. I want to get started with a little bit of housekeeping. As you just heard, we are recording this workshop this evening, and a link to that recording and a transcript will be made available after the workshop. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation, and if you would like to turn off your video feed, that sometimes helps the presentation run more smoothly if you're having connection issues. We will be using the comment box for questions and can also take vocal questions at the end of our presentation as well. We're also using the comment box to offer Spanish captioning for each slide. And as you can see, we have closed captioning on as well to make this presentation as accessible as possible for as many people as possible. This evening, we'll be sharing some information about the Conservation District, ourselves as presenters, and going over the unique challenges of managing your pasture and creating healthy pastures for you and your animals. Additionally, we've compiled a Google Drive folder of resources and publications that we would ordinarily have printed out for you at an in-person workshop. The link to that folder will be in the comments of this presentation and will also be posted with the recording and sent out to all participants at the end as well. And Nicole, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Awesome. So this workshop is being hosted by the Thurston Conservation District. Here at Thurston CD, we have been working with local residents since 1947. We serve residents of Thurston County who reside upon the indigenous lands of the Nisqually, Chehalis, and Squaxin peoples. We are one of about 45 districts in the state of Washington, and there are over 3,000 soil and water conservation districts nationally. If you're joining us from outside of Thurston County or outside of Washington State, as I know a few people are, we would really encourage you to connect with your local conservation district. And if you have questions about finding who that is, please feel free to reach out to us. Conservation districts were formed in the 1930s as a local, place, and community-based response to natural resource concerns. Nationally, conservation districts provide incentive-based programs, education, and non-regulatory technical assistance that make it accessible and more affordable for private landowners and individual residents to implement conservation on their property or in their home. All of our work is non-regulatory and voluntary, and because conservation districts are locally oriented, we are able to build our programming and offerings around the needs of our local community specifically. It looks like somebody is unmuted, so if you could mute yourself, that would be awesome. Thank you. So as I was saying, these districts, we really offer our services on a local level. And this workshop is part of that local response to local needs. A little bit of cross feedback there. So as I say, a local response to local needs. In 2019, we were awarded a grant from the Department of Ecology. And this grant is focused around bringing more awareness to water quality concerns in the Deschutes watershed of Thurston County and is aimed to help residents implement best management practices and in particular to help restore habitat around the streams and the Deschutes River in that watershed. This grant provides the Conservation District with funding to offer technical assistance and create workshops and guidance materials around topics like pasture management, manure and mud management, and designing your property to address your goals and concerns while also protecting natural resources. While this grant is focused in the Deschutes area, Thurston Conservation District does provide technical assistance to all of Thurston County. And if you have questions about improving your pastures, creating mud-free areas for your animals, or setting up an area and system to manage your manure, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information will be shared at the final slide in this evening, and you're also welcome to let us know in the comments. As we all work together to kind of stay healthy and keep moving forward, it has become really clear that we needed to look at how to hold some workshops online. And this has had the added benefit of allowing us to open up this opportunity to more folks and make this information available beyond our region. And this is the first in a 4-part series that is funded by this grant. I know many of you have signed up for the whole series or for a number of those. We'll share that information at the end as well. If you haven't and are interested, please feel free to join us. All right, next slide, Nicole. So there are 3 of us from Thurston CD on this presentation this evening, and we wanted to take just a moment to introduce ourselves. I speak for myself anyway, really miss holding workshops in person and getting to meet you and hear about your projects, but we'll do our best to be connected in this realm. So my name is Nora White. I work at the Conservation District as the Education and Outreach Specialist. In relation to pasture management, I also raise sheep, and so pasture management is near and dear to my heart and very critical for the success of my flock of sheep. I always learn something when I attend a workshop like this, even after doing it for years. So I am super grateful to be here to learn with you all tonight.
Hi, and my name is Kiana, and I work as the Community Outreach Assistant at the district. Part of my job, I get to do a lot of really awesome workshops like this, and I to see you all in person, and I really enjoy getting to engage with you all and learning from you. It looks a little bit different now that we're using an online platform, but it's still just as enjoyable, and I'm super excited that you all were able to join us this evening, and so thank you for taking the time to be here.
And my name's Nicole Warren. I'm a farm resource planner and technician at the district. And I work with community members to implement practices on their farm or homestead that improve their soil and crops and address their goals and concerns. And I work a lot with livestock producers to help them manage and restore their pastures.
So we want to know a little bit more about who's joining us today. So usually we like to do group introductions when we're meeting in person, but we thought today we could ask you some questions and y'all can share in the comment box. So I'm going to be monitoring our comments for questions and ideas throughout our workshop tonight. So if you have a question come up while we are presenting, please put them in the comment box, and at the end we will take some time to answer those questions. So at this time, if you have access to do so, go ahead and open up that comment box, and we would love for you to share a little bit about your backyard, your goals, or any particular issues you're struggling with or hoping we cover. So some things that we would love to hear from you are, what kind of livestock you have, how big is your pasture, and maybe what your #1 goal is on your farm or homestead. So we'll give you just a minute to go ahead and share in the comment box. Awesome. So it looks like we have a couple comments coming in. Dawn says that they have 10 acres and they grow hay. They have 2 horses and they need to manage their horse pastures and hay crop. We have another comment from Kevin. They're raising cows and want to control the weeds. Another comment from Carrie here says that they're struggling with tansy and buttercup. They have a horse boarding at a small facility where they manage their pastures. A lot of people mentioning that they have issues with different kinds of weeds. Marissa here says that they have 2 acres in Roy, 3 horses, and their pasture has lots of weeds, and they'd love to learn how to grow grass and hay and manage the mud and manure. A couple more here, Wayne and Kate, they have 12 acres, they have cows, pasture management, and they're interested in soil restoration. So great, we've got lots of comments rolling in, and I would encourage everybody to kind of look at all the people on the call tonight and kind of learn a little bit from your neighbors. So thank you for sharing, and I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Nicole to get started, and we're going to cover a lot of the different comments that people had.
Awesome. Well, it's great to hear what kind of livestock people have, and a lot of people want to get rid of weeds. That's a big one, and we're definitely going to talk about that tonight too. So I always like to start with just a little bit of framing about why we're here. So, you know, why is pasture management important anyway? And I imagine that all of you have different goals for your farm or your homestead, and some of the things that we're going to address today. You might be here to minimize mud, maybe weed pressure, like some of you mentioned, increasing grass production, maybe getting rid of bare spots in your pasture, or around watering and feed areas, improving your livestock health. And when we address those, we also address things like reducing compaction, improving drainage, improving water holding capacity of your soil, improving soil health, protecting water quality, and protecting fish and wildlife habitat. And I want to start by giving you an overview of what we're going to be covering today. My goal for this course is to start from the beginning and get you to a place where you feel like you can put things you've learned today into practice. Think of it like Pasture Management 101 with a big emphasis on rotational grazing. So today we're going to cover getting to know your pasture, what to know about forage grasses, how to develop a grazing system, how to set up pasture rotations, seasonal pasture maintenance, which refers to types of management practices that happen throughout the rotational grazing season. I'm going to touch briefly on why you might need a heavy use area or a confinement or sacrifice area. I'll provide an overview of what a heavy use area is and what particular challenges these areas try to address in our rainy climate in particular and in a rotational grazing system. And then how do I improve my pasture? So I'm going to provide an overview and a good starting point for thinking about what is involved in renovating your pasture. And doing so is definitely a multi-year process, going from overgrazing to a productive pasture with less weeds and more of the desired grasses definitely takes some time. And I'll say this too, is that I will be planning to teach kind of a sort of next step and maybe a advanced pasture course where we'll delve a little bit deeper into things like really specific like nutrients in pastures and some of those more specific pieces that come with renovating and understanding those. So a great way to stay in touch with the district in general is to sign up for our newsletter. We put a monthly newsletter out, and it's a great way to see what workshops are coming up, see highlights of our programs, get to know our staff. And we always put great articles in there as well. And we have several more online workshops planned for the summer. So getting to know your pasture. The first thing we need to do is look at site-specific conditions. Site-specific conditions is one of the main limiting factors that affect forage production. What I mean by that is that these limiting factors determine the potential forage production in your pastures. So every one of you has different site conditions on your land that really change the way you can manage it, the types of grass you can grow, and what different concerns there might be. So some of those site-specific conditions are soil type, soil structure, drainage, seasonal and year-round ponded areas, wetlands, streams, nearby water bodies, whether you irrigate or not, and current management and the kind of livestock that you have. And then, we really want to tie everything back to water quality as well, because they really have, if you're improving these conditions and really thinking about what's going to work best on your land, you're also doing what's best for water quality. So we want to ask the question, how do we protect our aquifers and minimize the amount of mud and manure at the same time? Manure definitely equals mud, and we'll talk more about that. And then how do we protect our water bodies and improve our pasture productivity with less weeds at the same time? So when it comes to our soil and the natural resources on our land, we have to ask a lot of questions. First things first, knowing a little about your soil really helps understand what it's capable of and some of the physiological properties that it has. Soil type refers to the texture of your soil, which is made up of different percentages of sand, silt, and clay particles. Soil structure refers to the way these particles arrange and assemble themselves into soil aggregates. And so soil type and soil structure impact drainage, as well as the soil's ability to retain moisture. In order for our grass to grow, the soil needs to be a certain temperature and certain moisture throughout that season. So at the right temperature and moisture ranges, soil microbial life is hard at work breaking down organic matter into plant available nutrients. And above ground, that's when we see that boost in growth. The moisture of the soil for grass to grow needs to be above 10% and below 60%. It can be a little tricky to estimate soil moisture, but understanding how well your soil stores water will help explain how grass grows on your property and what's happening when it becomes dormant at different points during the year based on seasonal rainfall and drought in southwestern Washington. Certain soils that cannot hold onto much water, like sandier soil types, typically need more frequent rain or watering for shorter periods of time. And so a lot of the rainwater or irrigation water will continue to move down below the root zone. So if you have heavy rainfall events, that kind of thing, and it moves down really quickly, kind of those more well-drained soils. So this is because sandier soils, they have less clay and less organic matter particles that actually hold a negative charge and hold onto water like a magnet. And those get kind of stored in those different air pockets and like how the soil aggregates organize themselves. And in soils where there's sort of less of those interactions happening, it doesn't hold as much. And so we have, there's in some ways that can be a really big advantage, right? You might have, already set up maybe some like heavily used or confinement areas around your barn. And if you have well-draining soils, they don't get as muddy. So that's definitely an advantage there. Certain soils, though, that hold on to more water, like a loam or silt soil type, typically don't need as frequent of rainfall or irrigation, but they need more each time, but in less frequent quantities to provide enough water for your plants. So soil types like this you tend to see more ponding on the surface that drains down slowly, or with rain, takes the soil particles with it and moves off the surface, which is not always visible. This is because the clay and silt being a lot smaller of particles than sand, they have more surface area, so they can hold on to water better, and that makes it take it can hold on to water better, but it takes longer for it to move through the soil profile. So if you have a soil type like this, you probably have grass that stays greener for a lot longer than some other areas in the county or your region. But in these soil types, we deal with a lot more mud and drainage concerns. That starts to tie into water quality concerns as well. When manure comes in contact with rain or ponded areas or creek beds on our property, certain nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and certain bacteria like E. coli will be picked up by rain and move with it. And like I said, sometimes this type of movement is not visible at all, but it's happening with every rainfall that is, drops on any kind of bare soil or pasture area that has short grass. because there's not a deep enough root structure for those plants to actually like take up those nutrients and act as that filter and hold on to that water. So we want to do what we can to manage these site conditions so that soil and nutrients from our manure don't end up in our aquifers and water bodies and that kind of thing. And we really look to different management practices that we're going to talk about to address those concerns. And really the goals to get you to a mud-free and well-productive pasture meet a lot of the same goals of protecting our natural resources. So that's awesome. And with less mud, we have less soil movement, and with more grass, you have these grasses taking up those nutrients from manure and acting as a filter. One other thing to keep in mind is that livestock graze really differently. So livestock have different nutritional needs and have different teeth structures that change the way they rip and tear forages and how low to the ground that they can do that. So horses and sheep, for instance, utilize their teeth a lot to graze, and they can graze low to the ground. Goats are also able to graze close to the ground as well with their full set of teeth, but they do prefer browsing on things like fresh leaves of perennial bushes and trees. So they'll go for that first. Whereas cows utilize their tongue a lot to tear grass, and due to the design of their lips, jaw, and teeth, cows actually can't get lower than 2 inches to the ground. When your livestock go out to pasture, they're able to identify every type of grass, legume form as they eat it. So super fast, right? And they see it like a salad bar. They'll always eat the most desirable thing first, and then they'll go back for more of the, less preferred grasses and legumes and that kind of thing, because they know that they're maybe not as high in sugar, and then they'll go back to regraze for a second time the things that are small before they'll go to eat something that they don't like as much. So it's interesting to kind of learn a little bit about those behaviors. And then that sheep and goats, they'll eat forages oftentimes that cows and horses won't. A lot of that has to do with their higher nutritional needs, and for some of them, they definitely can be a little less picky. So I want to talk a little bit about forage grasses and legumes now. So understanding what forages are in your pasture is really important. This is actually a great time of year to begin identifying grasses. The best thing I can recommend you do is actually just go for a pasture walk and notice the different seed heads that you see. So identifying grasses by their leaves, stems, and growth points is also possible, but right now we have the advantage of kind of seeing the different seed heads, and that's a lot easier and a really good place to start when you're learning to identify different forages in your fields. And I'll provide some more forage identification guides in the resources that we provide at the end. I actually really like using some different apps as well. If you've ever tried to do that, it's like having a whole dictionary on your phone, but in this case, you take a picture of it and it tells you what you're looking at. So some of those there's some like Seek is really cool. Picture This is another. There are many of them. And it's a real win because it can take years to learn how to identify these grasses and different legumes at different points of the year. So it's definitely a handy tool. And on the screen here, I've listed some common forage species that you'll see in your fields. So, and you've probably heard of some of them before. So ryegrasses, there's some different kinds, fescues, orchard grass, perennial clovers, meadow foxtail, vernal grass, bentgrass, and there are several different kinds of native grasses too. On the right, I actually have a few pictured. So the top is actually orchard grass. The middle is a perennial ryegrass, and the bottom is a tall fescue. So you can kind of see that they definitely have like specific signature characteristics, and so it's kind of fun to be able to point those out. And as we start to identify what's in our pasture, we can start to look at why these grasses, legumes, forbs are there, and which ones we want gone and which ones we want to keep. So for instance, certain grasses tolerate lower pH levels better than others. So orchard grass and perennial white clover, for instance, they want to be at a pH of at least 5.8, while ryegrasses and fescues can tolerate something a little bit more acidic like 5.5. But if the pH in your pasture fields is lower than 5.5, if you've ever done any soil testing, you'll likely see more grasses that don't grow as tall. They have smaller leaves. They tend to be tougher. These are some of the more later things that are on that list on the screens, like meadow foxtail, vernal grass, bent grass, native grasses. And another key factor is how wet or well draining your soil type is. So ryegrasses actually don't like to dry out completely. So they typically don't thrive in areas where that happens, maybe soils that are more drought prone. While orchard grass and fescue, on the other hand, they can tolerate moist conditions that are thrown at them and do well in drought prone soils. Some of you who are joining us tonight might have some big weed problems in your pasture. Heard some of you say that in the comments. And there are definitely a few key reasons for why that happens, and kind of starting to explain and understand why. Weeds thrive in lower fertility soils and overgrazed areas. So in those soil conditions, grasses don't do so well and can't compete. So weeds start to take over, and when they go to seed, they'll spread over larger areas on your land, which I'm sure you've seen. The good news is that if we start to support the grass that's there so that it grows more dense and more vigorous, grass actually can begin to outcompete these weeds. So that's sort of starting to think about how to get rid of them in that renovation process. And we'll talk more about that. I want to briefly take a look at grass and legume physiology to help demonstrate where the plant stores its sugars, why the height you start and stop grazing is so fundamentally important. And this is really a key piece in understanding kind of the art of rotational grazing. For reference, these pictures were taken from a book called Southern Forages, Modern Concepts for Crop Management, which is published by the International Plant Nutrition Institute. So on the left is a picture of a well-developed grass plant. There are a lot of anatomical features that are written out here, but I'm going to focus on a few. So right at the base of the plant, above ground, is the crown. So I actually have a little laser pointer here. So I'm talking about this piece right here. And the crown, it being the base of the grass plant, it is the connecting tissue between the roots and the shoots of the plant. And this area is really critical to kind of know a little bit about, to understand the regrowth of grass plants. It's the area where you'll find the buds that determine if regrowth will be successful. So those need to be there in terms of seeing more production above that. When we talk about pasture management, we're going to kind of dig into this a little bit more, but the golden rule, and you've probably heard it, and hopefully I can help you understand a little bit more about why, is that we don't want to graze below 3 or 4 inches. And this really has to do with the location of that crown and the apical meristems that come off of it and kind of are at the base of the leaves, the lower leaves in particular, and those are the growth points of the grass plant. And so if we graze those, it takes a lot of energy for the plant to regrow these. And if the plant has to regrow these, then it won't be able to put much energy back into leaf production. And when we talk about improving a pasture, we often talk about managing for a key species. So if you haven't heard that, if that's new, I'm going to talk more about that. But different grass species like to be grazed at either 3 to 4 inches. There's a little bit of leeway for different specific species, but definitely not lower than that. That's where the plant is storing its energy. That's where its growth points are. So orchard grass, for instance, doesn't tolerate overgrazing well at all. And that might be a bummer because I know a lot of people really want to see orchard grass in their field. It's definitely a hay that people like to buy. It doesn't want to be grazed lower than 4 inches. And this all has to do with where those growth points is located on the plant. Whereas ryegrasses, on the other hand, can tolerate grazing a little lower and still recover well. And that's more like 3 inches around there. This has to do with the location of those stems, as I've talked about. And honestly, oftentimes the grasses that are most sensitive to overgrazing are usually the forages that we want to stay there the most, and the ones that we really want to keep. One other feature to note is that to the right of the roots, you'll see the rhizomes, which are over here. So these ones that they're above ground, and then you'll see that then they grow roots that go in, and then you'll see this other, sorry, those are the stolons, and then the rhizome, that's that underground root coming up. So different grasses will do this depending on the type of grass that it is, typically one or the other. And that is the main way that we're going to see like a denser stand of forage, and thinking about also how can we encourage that from happening is really important. So on the right, this is a picture of a legume. In this case, it's a red clover. Legumes have a similar structure to grass. You can kind of see, like, if you spend some time after when this presentation is available, a lot of the things that are labeled are really similar. The main differences are that the crown of the plant, like we talked about with the grass, is actually lower to the ground. And that legumes, so grasses store a lot of their energy in that above ground crown, but legumes, see how they have even like a thicker, wider taproot coming down from the crown? They store a lot of their energy actually below ground. And because of this, legumes can tolerate more heavy grazing pressure of their leaves and are not as easily stressed because they actually make some of their own nitrogen. And that has to do with a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, if you've ever heard of nitrogen fixation. Excuse me. So if given the opportunity, legumes will outcompete grass because they can produce some of their own nutrients. And that oftentimes, sometimes you'll see in like overgrazed pastures, you'll see dense areas of like legumes or clovers, and that is sometimes why. On the other hand, if you're wondering why you don't have a lot of clover in your field and it's something you want to establish, it could be because of the pH level. Legumes prefer a pH of 6.0 and don't tolerate very acidic soils like some grasses that we talked about do. The last feature I'll mention is how legumes spread. So clovers and other legumes have stolons. So similar to that above ground sort of tillering effect that you see in the grass, it extends from the base of the plant and comes out. Yeah, so those are some of like the very key and basic features of these different types of plants in our fields that are really important to pay attention to. Now we're going to talk about how grass grows in our climate and what it looks like in different stages of development. For reference, these graphs and pictures were taken from a Pacific Northwest Extension publication called the Western Oregon and Washington Pasture Calendar. And it's a collaboration of research from Oregon State University, Washington State University, and is that Utah? Yeah, so there's a few different ones there. And this resource is actually going to be available at the end of this presentation too. So the picture on the left shows grass in 3 different stages of development. So there's the vegetative, and then elongation, and then reproductive stages. In the vegetative state, the grass is the most tender, having low levels of hemicellulose and lignin, which are organic compounds that make up the structure of the plant, means that your animal will digest it quickly, and this is when the nutrients in the grass are most bioavailable. In the elongation state, the grass starts to become more mature and increases in those harder to digest compounds. The reproductive stage is where the grass starts to go to seed and has the least amount of bioavailable nutrition. A big misconception that I often hear, especially with horse owners, is that tall grass is the highest in sugars, when actually tall grass has more of those compounds, cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, and as that grass gets taller, those grasses get lower in available sugars, and it takes longer for that animal to actually digest it. So this can be really particularly important for horse owners too, because we oftentimes want to have forage that is lower in sugars if we're concerned about animals that could founder. But we're also concerned potentially with spring grass and bloat with other types of livestock. So moving on, the graph on the right, top right, shows us how the rate of growth changes during each one of these development stages. So the x-axis is showing time, the y-axis is showing growth. And then you can kind of see that nexus, which is between the best yield and most sort of tender stage in the life cycle of the grass. And that's that point we're trying to reach whenever we're grazing. The graph shows that the time where those two usually intersect is in the vegetative phase, in the late vegetative phase, but that depends a little bit on the grass itself. This is a sweet spot where we've got kind of the highest potential yield in that field at that time, and it's the most nutrient dense. Grazing at this time also ensures the fastest possible regrowth, which will be different depending on your site and climate conditions. The growth stage that is best to start grazing does vary slightly from vegetative to kind of that early elongation. We're aiming for that growth stage when you're just starting to see some seed heads develop, but they're small enough that they can they're not completely rolled out of the leaf. So that's on this graph on the left. I put kind of start grazing at like 8 to 12 inches is typically when you want to start, and then stopping grazing at 3 to 4 inches like we talked about. And another way to look at that too is take half, leaf half is probably something you've heard before. The bottom graph on the bottom right starts to explain why. So this is a picture of the typical grass growth cycle in the Pacific Northwest for cool season grasses. We grow mostly cool season grasses here. The x-axis shows how growth varieties throughout the grass season, shows sort of how growth changes throughout that grass season. The y-axis is showing the above and below ground grass growth rate. So it's showing grass above ground, root actual extension below. And the solid line is showing the above ground, and the dotted line is showing the below ground growth. The graph starts with summer. And then just thinking with this too, you can kind of see that grass is a mirror image of itself. And that means that the amount of leaf growth above ground typically mirrors the amount of root growth below ground, especially in the fall, and you'll kind of see in the spring that we'll see even more above ground growth than below ground growth. The graph starts by showing us that it's showing us with late summer and early fall first, which is kind of funny there, but you'll see that we get that boost right when it starts raining again. And then, you know, before that like boost, and kind of where this graph like begins and ends, you know, when we have all of that heat and drought stress and not a lot of moisture in the ground, that causes the stomata of the plant to close, and that decreases the amount of CO2 that it's intaking, and the plant stops photosynthesizing. So the grass goes dormant. So when the grass is dormant and it turns brown, it's actually not dead. It shuts down production for a while to conserve energy, and it waits for those good conditions again to start growing. So this means that during that time, the plant is really relying on the sugar it's stored up in its crown and its roots in the springtime to get through the summer before it starts growing again in the fall. And as we move into that, you'll kind of see, so we get that big bump in the fall, huge amount of root growth during that time. And that fall is one of the two main times that the grass is really building up those energy reserves. So you can look at that dotted line as when the grass is really building up reserves for later. And that's really important because if we're grazing at a time when the grass isn't growing much and it's really relying on those energy stores, if we're kind of taking away from that energy, or we're ripping out kind of, you know, that crown part, that part that we talked about, and the plant has to put a lot of energy into regrowing that part, that's when we start to see in the spring. Some people, you know, might have their pasture grow a lot earlier than other folks. And while there's a few different, you know, soil conditions that can be a part of that as well, grazing during the fall and the winter when the grass isn't growing, and grazing in the summer when the grass isn't growing, it can actually delay regrowth for up to 6 weeks. So that's when you'll see, you know, your grass not bouncing back as fast as you'd like it to, and not having maybe the yield that you'd like it to as well. And unfortunately, if you repeat that cycle over and over again, especially because of how grass stores its sugars, you'll slowly see your pasture production continue to go down and more weeds creep in. So, you know, the graph kind of ends in this case with showing us that, like I said, the highest amount of production happens in the spring. We all know what it feels like when we have more grass than we know what to do with in May and June, and always wish there was more come July and August. It certainly makes for a really tricky balance, and that's why the time we rest and return back to grazing an area has to be adjusted based on this grass growth curve for fastest regrowth and highest production. So that's why it's really important to kind of learn about what's going on at different points in the season. So now we're going to talk a bit about setting up rotations, which is kind of the fun part, or it can be. So there are a lot of options when it comes to designing paddocks for rotational grazing. And I've got a bunch of different examples that I want to show you. These examples on this page were taken from the Canadian Cattleman magazine, and it shows 6 different rotational grazing setups. In all of these systems, only one cell would be open at a time. Once you open up a new area for the livestock, then the previous area would be closed immediately to allow for regrowth. The top left and top middle show 2 different setups that have an alleyway. The nice thing about an alleyway is that this can be one pathway that leads back and forth from the barn or run-in sheds. This method works really well if your areas have a permanent setup. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to use permanent or temporary fencing, but the alleyway will end up being heavily used and you can expect it to become bare soil. In these types of setups, the livestock typically do not have access to the alleyway when they're in the grazing paddock. That really helps reduce mud. However, if you want more of a free choice and passive system where the animals have access to protection from the elements or ability to go back for free choice hay, the alleyway can be left open. The top right shows a really simple setup that would work best if your livestock were staying on pasture all night and don't leave their enclosure. This design is sometimes called the New Zealand block system. If you have sheep or goats that stay out on pasture the whole time during the grazing season, this simple setup would work great. The biggest concern would be the labor of having to move the water each time. With a small herd, not such a big deal, but with more than a few animals, this means emptying your big water trough and moving it each time you move your animals. The bottom left goes one step further than the last one we looked at. It's still that simple grid system, but each 4 cells shares a water trough. So that's what that box in the middle is there. And this design is sometimes called a Texas block system. This can be a way of setting up the pasture with 4 big water troughs that you don't have to move each time. But whenever you have an area that's getting regular access, it's an opportunity for mud, especially where there's water. This is always something to keep in mind with permanent water setups. If the animals are being moved really frequently, though, this can be managed well. You can still expect any watering or feed areas to have poor grass production and likely become bare. In areas that are bare, though, you can reseed them with something like annual ryegrass, maybe even a cereal rye or oat in September, and let it grow all winter long. Annual ryegrass can be a great option for bare areas in your pasture. It establishes really quickly for good coverage, but the longevity of it is really short, which means it won't last that long in terms of usually needs to be reseeded every year or 2 in an area that's you're renovating, or in a case where you know it's going to get mudded up again, it would be something you'd have to do every year. Keep in mind, though, that if you allow your animals to have access to any area before the plant has had a chance to get well established, you will be back where you started with a lot of mud. So the bottom middle is a very popularized rotation grazing system. It's not utilized a ton in our region. In this system, the livestock move from cell to cell in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction. This design is sometimes called a wagon wheel system. In the setup, there's usually only one central water location. I'd say that while this one looks really fun, it can be tricky to manage well, especially here. You can expect that the area near the center of the wheel where the animals congregate will become very muddy and will be difficult to maintain. So if you like this system, it would make the most sense to put down some type of footing around the feeding area that has a geotextile fabric underneath. But then you kind of created a much more permanent rotation system for yourself. And lastly, on this page, the bottom right shows a demonstration of strip grazing, and actually has a variety of different size paddocks, kind of showing you maybe some different options. Since this is done with electric fencing, these paddock sizes could change based on the season. We'll talk a little bit more about that next. Strip grazing refers to giving your livestock a small strip or section of the pasture each day, typically every single day that you're moving them. This works best if you close the livestock behind, if you close the paddock behind the livestock when you open them up to the next one, so that you can have really good regrowth. The downsides to strip grazing is that it can be really tricky to determine how much forage your livestock actually need in one day. To set this up, it takes a bit of planning, especially if your goal is on really good weight gain or milk production. It really helps to have kind of a basic understanding of your livestock forage needs and the pounds of production per acre that your pasture is currently producing. These two factors help you calculate how much area you need to give your livestock each day. If you don't give your livestock enough grass, they can get skinny, so it's important to really monitor a system like this closely and make adjustments regularly throughout the growing season. This is definitely the most labor-intensive rotational grazing system that there is, but it can be really rewarding too. One of the biggest advantages to giving livestock small areas is that you'll see that they'll be less picky and eat more uniformly. There's a little bit more pressure on them in terms of getting enough food for themselves and for everybody there. And when you do this and you're closing them in and they have kind of a pretty short flash grazing of an area, you'll see the fastest regrowth. And you'll see that you'll be able to go back to that paddock much more quickly than in some other setups. So I want to show you just a few more options. There's a horse in the picture, and these do work really well for horses, but can work really well for small herds of other livestock too. This image was taken from a publication from the North Carolina Extension Service. These systems pictured allow your livestock to have their access to shelter, feed, and water throughout the day that are located in a heavily used area. So typically kind of that area that's pretty much pictured white on these different pictures that have the red shelter and the blue water source are kind of your heavily used or confinement area. And one of the reasons that people really like this with horses is that they're often being brought into the barn every night, and that because you're monitoring their grazing pretty closely, that sometimes you only graze them for short periods each day. Each paddock is still able to be opened and closed for good rotational grazing practices. And out of all the different systems that we've kind of looked at, this one definitely requires less management. And then it's kind of showing you some different sizes, kind of maybe based on your goals or the number of animals that you have. And the middle, the third picture from the left, those dots are temporary fencing, so it's kind of showing you what it might look like on the left if you had a more permanent setup versus temporary, where you can see there's much more smaller areas, and maybe the size of that could change throughout the growing season depending on how much grass was available at the time. These do require a lot more initial setup though. As you can see, you're kind of planning for your whole property. The area that they do have access to all the time definitely needs some kind of footing, and in order for it to get the least amount of mud in there and to be managed well, the manure typically needs to be picked up very frequently. And then I do want to just touch upon fencing considerations just a bit. So there are many different types of permanent and movable fencing options out there for whatever paddock design you choose. There are a lot of resources too for figuring out which type of fencing works well for different types of livestock. And I'll just give a handful of tips here. So for horses or for cattle, typically either electric or temporary fencing is used. For temporary fencing, for either of those types of livestock, you just need one line of poly wire or tape or metal wire, depending on what your choice is. And that's set up typically between so above the knee and kind of a little bit below the shoulder. And the idea is that you want the animal to not quite feel like they can easily jump over it. And if you're not quite comfortable with kind of guessing where that might be, you can also find what's called pigtail posts, and those are great and available at any farm store, and they kind of have like a predetermined height where the line runs through, and those work awesome for horses or for cattle. But I know that electric fencing isn't always an option for people, and some people don't like to use it, especially if you have a horse with a lot of energy. I work with a lot of horse owners that love to use it, but every once in a while I work with someone that has tried it and their horses just don't respect it. That happens. For goats and sheep, though, the most common setup is electric netting, if you've seen that before. And this works really well with them. They can be a little bit more tricky for keeping it contained. And the nice thing about that netting is that it can be set up in many different orientations and sizes. Typically the netting is 3 to 4 feet high, and with sheep or with goats, it's typically like 4-inch by 4-inch spacing in the net in the different cells. And then goats are oftentimes really tricky tricksters, and fencing them can be really difficult. If you have goats, you probably know how that you can relate to that a lot. And you know, that can be tricky, and so it does, you know, help to kind of try some different systems with your animals and see what's going to work best for you, both for your management system and what's the most economical choice. And then for sheep too, some people actually, instead of using the netting, like to kind of get more of a semi-permanent setup going, which usually looks like about 6 or 7 lines of the poly or metal wire that's electrified. Sometimes that's called kind of New Zealand style fencing. When using the wire or tape, in any case, usually you do T-posts at the corners and fiberglass posts with insulators throughout the rest of it. And those are just a few tips. In the resources that we provide at the end, there's a really great publication from WSU that goes into different fencing types and considerations for each one. In the past too, we've taught whole workshops just on fencing alone. So stay tuned because we have another one planned in the future. And also, if you have specific questions about fencing, please put a comment in the comment box and we'll read through and answer those at the end. The last example I want to share with you is a little more specialized. It's called a track paddock. I bet some of you have heard of it. I really like the aerial imagery on the right so that you get a sense of the whole kind of picture of what I'm talking about. So a track paddock is a walking pathway set up around the outside of your grazing area. It's a way to provide more exercise for your livestock while controlling their access to pasture, especially if you have less land. I work with one landowner that has a track set up on 7 acres, and it wraps around a big hayfield and makes its way back to the barn, and her horses walk about 4 to 5 miles a day. So it's pretty cool. And she has slow feeders and waterers set up in different areas along the track to encourage movement. She's experimented over the years to determine the right width of the paddock for her horses. The width kind of depends on your livestock temperament and the number of animals that you have that will be walking that track. You want it to be narrow enough that they'll keep moving through it, but not too narrow that the livestock feel like they don't have enough space to get around each other. And if you're interested in learning about that, there's a resource that'll be available at the end, but also there's a great book called Paddock Paradise. So that's another awesome resource to check out. Soil type is a big factor when deciding if a track paddock would be right for you and your land. Consider having footing for the track paddock if you have poorly draining soils. The bottom left is a picture of the track with a gravel footing, and the right aerial picture is of a bare track with some vegetation growing in some of the areas. It can work really well to leave the soil bare if you have well-draining soils, but it will only work if manure is collected very frequently, like every few days or maxed up to a week. Remember that manure causes a lot of mud, and managing manure is really important for protecting habitat and water quality. I recently made a really awesome handout about managing your manure that kind of digs a little bit into storing it, like how and when to apply it at the right time and rate, for all of those considerations, both for your grasses having the most availability to it to see the most boost in your production, and also, you know, for managing it really well and some of those water quality concerns that we talked about. It's a great resource for kind of getting in the swing of things and implementing some good management practices. So that's also going to be available at the end. And we have a workshop coming up on July 28th that will delve into more detail about managing manure. And that's a really great workshop that's happening that I definitely recommend you check out if you want to learn more about that. And last week, actually, we did a workshop on managing compost and manure in more of an urban setting with a focus on smaller properties with smaller livestock in mind. Get in touch with us if you'd like a recording of that workshop. And I just wanted to take a chance, since I talked about track paddocks, to show you a few examples of these slow feeders that I talked about. I would say they're most commonly used with horses, but you could definitely come up with something similar for any other kind of livestock that you have. The one on the left is probably the most commonly seen slow feeder. The two on the right are examples of ones that are more in a trough or maybe a constructed box, and they have a metal grid placed down into it. I work with a few landowners that have slow feeder boxes and they absolutely love them. And typically you don't want the feeder, no matter what setup you choose or what kind of one you might create, you just want it to be high enough off the ground that the way that the animal is eating is good for digestion and prevents colic. So the idea is that they're kind of getting little pieces of grass. You see less waste, and also for horses in particular, it mimics a more of like a wild horse eating pattern, or like more what you would see when you think of an environment of a horse in like a rangeland or on a prairie, where they're covering vast amount of distance each day. When they're doing that, they're eating little bites of forage all day long as they go. And typically that grass would be more in a reproductive stage, like we talked about. So the forage is lower in nutrition and takes longer to digest. Pacific Northwest isn't quite a normal environment, especially for horses in particular too. We grow some of the best grass in the world, and we know it. The Pacific Northwest is the largest exporter of grass seed, and it's known all over the world for its production of cool season grasses. Grasses here have an upwards of 32% protein when it's fresh and in the field. And that can be really rich for horses, which is why, you know, I mentioned this earlier, but why we have to manage for pasturing horses in a particular way. And placing these slow feeders in your confinement areas or track paddock, it's not only a great way to feed your horses, keep them from getting bored, but it helps reduce the risk of founder for horses that are more prone to it than others. Okay, so you're probably asking, how do I figure out how big and how many paddocks to have in my pasture? When it comes to figuring out how to set up pasture rotations, I have a worksheet that can help you estimate this, which is on the screen right now. I took a tool that I use with farm planning and I tried to make it a little bit more user friendly. This tool is a really good starting point and can be a really good general guideline to follow. It helps you calculate how much area your number of livestock will need daily for grazing, how much area each paddock should be based on how many days your livestock will be in there, how many total paddocks you'll need, and how much acreage you'll need altogether. The nice thing about this sheet is that you can play around with the different number of days that they're in the paddock, the different number of rest days as the season changes, and you'll see that it can help you calculate how that would look differently, especially if you're using temporary fencing and you saw some of those examples of designs where you can change the size of the area. That's when playing around with this can be pretty cool as well. So on the sheet, the green cells in the 7 steps are the pieces that you fill out, and then the yellow is all what's automatically calculated for you. And I'm just going to briefly walk you through it so that this is something you can use. So the first step there at the top, we need to calculate the pounds of forage dry matter needed per day for the total number of livestock you have. Bear with me. So dry matter refers to the amount of forage remaining after all the water and moisture content's been removed. It's the typical way that you see feed reflected. Maybe it's on like a bag of feed, the sheet, or maybe it's, if you work with someone you get your hay from, they'll likely give you the nutrition on a dry matter basis. And it gives us a more accurate representation of the amount of nutrients in it, even if the amount of water content is fluctuating throughout the year. So that's kind of that beginning piece. So for step 1, you first need to input the number of animals you have. That's the first box. The second box is the weight per animal. So I've got 5 tables at the bottom of the sheet that will help you answer what to fill out in each of those green boxes. So for the weight, if you refer to table 3 down there, and you'll kind of see that the sheet has notes of where to go. So for this example, we have 2 horses, and average weight of a horse is 1,000 pounds. So 2 livestock times 1,000 pounds average weight. And then it's asking for the percent of daily dry matter intake. So the dry matter need that I just explained. And you'll go down to table 4. And so for this one, the ones that I chose for this example are highlighted in green. So in table 4, it says the maintenance, and there's a note at the bottom that says for horses, select the lowest percentage of the category you choose. So maintenance is 2 to 3, so it's 2% that I put in step 1. So that gives us 40 pounds. And so that's the 40 pounds is the amount of daily forage we need for our 2 horses. So then we go to step 2, and we need to calculate the amount of forage required after we've adjusted for utilization rate. So forage utilization refers to the amount of available feed in a pasture. So the rate accounts for the different types of management and trampling rate. So yeah, everything that's in the field isn't actually going to get eaten. They're going to walk on a bunch of it, and they're not going to eat that part. If you go down to table 1, you'll see that the number of days of rotation that you choose has a different utilization rate, right? So if they're in an area for longer, they're going to trample more of it, they're going to use less. And it might sound like, oh wow, 50%, that's such a small amount of what's there that they're going to utilize, but that's actually a really good general utilization rate. So for this example, it's 50% based on the number of days that I chose for the amount of time they're going to be in the paddock. So step 2, we know there's 40 pounds of daily forage dry matter, and it's going to be 50% utilization rate. So we know that we need 80 pounds of daily dry matter for our horses. All right, so then when we move down to step 3, it's asking us to determine the amount of forage dry matter in pounds that's in our field. So in order to figure that out, we go down to table 2, and this is where we're kind of trying to calculate the potential yield of your pasture. So this part takes a little bit more experience and finesse, and it's something we typically work with landowners and determine with them or for them based on a forage assessment that we do in the farm planning process. So I would say that if you're not quite familiar about how to determine the condition of your pasture, or if your pasture is currently overgrazed, then go with the fair condition. So we're going on the lower end. And then if you're not familiar with the grasses yet that are in your field, that's still something you need to work on, right? Or you're going to learn that later. You can go with the mixed pasture and start there. So those are some really good general baselines. For this example though, since I know a little bit more about what's going on, I know that her field with the horses has a lot of tall fescue in it, and it's got clover in it, and we've been working on some different rotational grazing, and we've been working on resting it. So the condition is good. So if you go to step 3, we put 400 pounds. So now that we know how much actual food is in that pasture, and the calculation is per acre per inch, we know that if we start grazing at 8 inches and we have to do take half, leave half, that means we have 4 inches for them to eat. So it starts to get smaller and smaller. And then when we move down to step 4, you'll see that that one's already calculated for us. So when you input your information, that one will tell you, based on the information we wrote in step 1, 2, and 3, actually how much land you need for your animals daily. So we haven't gotten into the size of it yet, but we know kind of a base of how much they need each day. So for this one, it says 0.05 acres, right? That's not really something that makes a lot of sense, but if you do the, acreage, what's the equivalent in square feet? It's 2,200, and that roughly looks like a 50-foot by 50-foot section. So then we move on to step 5, where we need to write in the number of days we want them to be in each paddock. So this is the one that you can keep adjusting and see how it changes. So for this example, we chose 6 days in each paddock, which is a long time. You could say, well, maybe I'll just try like 2 or 3, and actually they'll utilize more of it. They'll, go faster through areas, or maybe I want it a little longer. So you can play with the difference and kind of see what kind of comes out when you do that. So then it takes that amount that the animals need per day, and it times it for the 6 days it's going to be there, and then it gives you the size of that paddock. So if I change the different days, it's going to give me a different size area. And then step 6 is the other one that you can play around with. And so I have a table down at the bottom that says the average rest period days. So it's referring to that. So for this example, we didn't talk about this quite in any detail yet, but we talked about the grass growth curve, and that grass is growing at a different rate throughout the season. So if the grass is growing slower, we need to rest it longer, right? And in the spring, where it's growing the fastest, we need to rest it for the least amount of time. This table has like general guidelines. So for spring, it says 21 days. But if you have super fast growing pasture in a pasture that's in really good conditions, you actually only might need 14 days of rest. So it fluctuates a little bit, and that's another number that you can change. But this is a good table for kind of general guidelines. And the nice thing about that is you can fill this all out and then say, okay, how big do my paddocks need to be in the spring and in the late summer and in the fall, and then so you can kind of play with different sizes as well. And then the last step, 7, it calculates for you. It gives you the amount of acreage that you would need, but I don't want this to confuse anybody. What they're showing you is under this scenario, with this much grass production, with this much utilization, and with the animals being in each paddock this long, this is the amount that you would need if 100% of their feed during those grazing months or that season, if 100% of it was coming from the pasture. So in this case, if the acreage is more than you have, that just means that you're probably going to need to supplement feed, right? And potentially in some times and other times not, right? Like probably not in the spring, probably going to need to in the summer, kind of that. And again, this is just a general guideline. The more dialed in that you get with knowing exactly how much your pasture is producing, the more that step 7 becomes useful. So for just the purpose of starting out, really the answers for 5 and 6 are going to be the most useful for you. figuring out how big and how many paddocks to set up. So that sheet is going to be available in the resources, already set up with you for it to calculate. So hopefully that's something that you can have fun with. And so now that we've talked about setting up rotations, we're going to talk just briefly about the need for setting up heavy use areas. And, you know, we talked about needing to rest your pastures. And so, well, where do we put them? Where do we put our livestock when we have to rest them if we don't have another area that's regrowth, that has enough regrowth to put them into, right? Or what do we want to do if we decide now, if we're doing good grazing practices, that we don't want to graze them in the late fall and winter time when the grass isn't growing. So there are many reasons why we need to be able to control when livestock are on and off pasture, right? And we've talked about quite a few of them, but we know we want to protect against overgrazing, and that's going to improve grass growth. You know, we briefly touched upon resting periods. So winter resting period when the grass isn't growing so that it has enough energy to grow well in the spring. Summer resting period if there's a drought and the grass stops growing so that it has enough energy to grow grass in the fall. And it gets us closer to the dream of zero mud, right? That's everybody's dream. No one wants any mud on their property. And if we're resting those areas and we're sort of managing more about where our livestock are at different times of the year, we're going to have less and less mud. So, you know, it's also going to help with managing composting and spreading of manure if that's something that's interesting to you, but also what do we do with it and how do we manage it in general? This is going to be really important. And of course, like I've said a few times, if we're managing all of those things, we're doing a lot to protect the natural resources on our property. And if we're going to implement pasture rotation where we're allowing sections of time for pastures to rest and regrow, then we need a well-designed and well-set-up confinement area that livestock can go when there's not a paddock that's 6 or 8 inches high of grass. And like I said, when grass isn't growing, if the grass does go dormant on your property, and you know, oftentimes we have droughts in our summer, so of course that changes a little bit with what happens with rainfall and what happens that year. And then, as I said, during fall and winter, which is typically October through March, when the grass isn't growing, and this is really going to help us avoid causing compaction. So I want to talk about compaction for just a minute. So when the soil is saturated with water, it doesn't have a strong structure. I think of I really like the sponge analogy. If your sponge is dry and you like push, like, you know, at your sink, you haven't used it today, it's dry, you push on it, it's like really firm, right? But if you saturate that with water, you can, not only can you like push right through it, but you can even squeeze out all the water. Soil is no different. The holes in your sponge is like the pores in your soil that hold onto water and air. And they form when soil particles stack and stick to each other, like we talked about at the beginning. And so when the soil's full of water, in those rainy season or after heavy rainfall, it doesn't have as strong of a structure. And so when livestock or equipment walk on those soils at that time, you're more likely to see pooling on the surface caused by compaction. And that will lead to affecting grass growth later on. And when the soil dries after that happens, it has more of like a platey texture, like it's been squished, like a stack of pancakes, instead of looking like something like Swiss cheese. And plant roots, they have a really difficult time of pushing their roots through hard compacted soil, and they can't get enough water and they can't get enough air that they need to be really productive. So another thing we want to avoid, and another benefit to doing some of those rests and setting up an area like this where we can have livestock when we want to do those rests. And there are a lot of considerations when thinking about how to set up this area. The two pictures on the screen do show gravel footing, which would look like typically it is 6 to 12 inches below the level ground that you put geotextile fabric, and then you use a larger crushed rock and then a finer crushed rock footing on top of that. Now, the amount that you would do, the type that you would do, depend a little bit on your site conditions and your soil type and drainage and some of those considerations, maybe how you would slope it, those kind of things. But that's not the only option that you can do. Depending on your soil type, some people like to use sand, some people like to use hog fuel and wood chips, but the thing about that is because it's organic material, it will get saturated, start to compost, and usually needs to be scraped every year and started over. So there are some different things to use and several different considerations to thinking about what's going to work for you. So on August 25th, we'll actually be teaching an online workshop specifically on heavy use areas and like all those different considerations. So this will be a really great resource to kind of dig into that more. For starters, though, there will be a few great resources provided at the end of this workshop to help you kind of think and begin to think about what it might look like, what you want that to be set up like. And we do offer one-on-one technical assistance and work with folks to help them come up with those types of designs. So now, you know, if you started to develop that grazing system, you're working to protect your pasture from overgrazing, kind of what's next, right? That's definitely everything we've covered so far is step one. Like that all has to be the highest priority for improving things in your field. And some things to think about next there are a few good ones that you can also get started with. So harrowing, if you've heard of that before or not, the bottom right picture is a picture of just like a simple tine harrow. Harrows, they're not expensive and they don't require a tractor or a PTO. It's something you can simply drag with an ATV, a four-wheeler, a truck if needed. Harrows break up manure piles and redistribute the nutrients more evenly on the soil surface. So this will improve plants being able to utilize the nutrients from the manure. If you've ever seen green patches in your pasture, that's where there are manure piles from last year or much earlier in the season. And by harrowing, you'll see much more even distribution, especially of nitrogen, and a more even distribution of sort of that green flush growth. Harrowing also helps aerate the soil and even out the soil surface, especially if you have something like moles. That can be really nice. And then mowing is another one that I wanted to touch upon, especially since so many people want to start to control the weeds in their fields. I can't stress enough how important mowing is if you want to change the composition, right, of what's there of like grass and legume species. So mowing's the first step in weed control in your fields. Typically, at least once a year, mowing in the late spring when undesirable plants are blooming before they go to seed. It will stress out the plant and help your grass by that plant becoming less vigorous. And this can be tricky with early blooming plants. So mowing definitely doesn't get everything, but it's a really, really great way to start to reduce that for not only weeds, but also grasses that you don't want. You're preventing those grasses from going to seed, and therefore you're encouraging other ones that you want to be there to stay there, and you're keeping more of that grass vegetative for the next rotation when you put your animals back in. And weed control is all about minimizing the presence of weeds. It often takes many years to get rid of a weed completely. But if you implement the practice we've talked about tonight, you'll see a major decline in the first few years. For certain weeds, chemical or mechanical management techniques may be helpful initially, but those alone typically do not get rid of weeds for good. If the same conditions remain in your fields, then these resilient weeds will just come right back. So mowing also encourages tillering in your grass and branching and legumes. It minimizes the effects of selective grazing. It improves palatability of those grasses, and it encourages forages to stay in their vegetative state for longer. In the resources at the end, I've made a whole folder of different weeds and potential management for them. So if you have like a specific weed and you want to know how to get rid of it, that's a really good place to start. And on there as well are soil testing and fertilizing. That's not something that I got into tonight. That's something that I want to dig into a lot more detail in the more advanced pasture management workshop that I'm planning to teach. And soil testing does improve your pH and correct nutritional deficiencies. It's also really important after you start to implement rotations. And if you want to learn more about that or get how to get started, we have a soil testing program at the district that I run, and it's a great resource for understanding what's going on in your soil. I kind of write up a report of what's high, what's low, the ranges in it, and recommendations for how to get things into the range that we want them to be in. The top picture on this slide is a landowner spreading powdered limestone fertilizer using a drop spreader. And we actually have this same piece of equipment available to rent at the district. So more information about our soil testing program and our equipment rental program can be found on our website. And I mentioned briefly reseeding bare areas with ryegrass for fast establishment. This can be really handy, but like I said, you need to rest that area that you reseed for at least 4 to 6 months before you have livestock on it. The pull test is a really good way to determine if it's ready. If you try to pull it out of the ground and it comes out easily, roots and all, it's not ready to have hooves walking on it. But reseeding can definitely be really helpful in some of those areas that maybe there's water and feed at, or maybe the livestock were on there for too long, which totally happens, never going to be perfect. And yeah, this is a lot of management, and it's a lot of different techniques, and hopefully it's not too overwhelming. And I think the biggest thing next is, you know, figuring out how to make it work for you and for your family. And I will say that identifying your goals, starting with one thing at a time, starting with one area of your property in the first year is really helpful. You don't have to do everything right in every part of your property all at once. Things take time, and this lowers the risk and it makes it way more manageable. And it really helps to try to come up with, you know, a plan for multiple years if you're interested in kind of trying to implement all these different pieces, or all these pieces on all the areas on your property. And that, yeah, it just takes several years to improve your pasture. And I wanted to briefly show an example of a 4-year plan. So plan can be as many years or as little years as you want it to. But what I liked about trying to break this out, and this is what I do a lot with landowners that I work one-on-one with, is I really try to encourage them to start small, and maybe even just start with, so you want to do rotations, just do it in one section. Just take one area and be like, okay, I'm going to do everything right in that area this year. So in this example, year 1, you've made an initial plan, you set up your first rotations in one section. In that one section, you're going to do mowing and harrowing. You're going to think about, like, well, where could I put a heavy use area, and why don't I try it out here? You know, where can I store the manure that I'm picking up now? And, you know, maybe I'll try to put it here, and I'm just going to cover the pile as I start to figure out other systems. Maybe I play with reseeding some areas and see what that does. And then the second year, you can start to adjust your plan, because now you've tried it and you know what's not going to work for you and what maybe you're interested in doing more of. Maybe you now want to do rotations in 2 areas instead of 1, because you're like, okay, I got this area kind of figured out. Like that's good. I'm going to try to do this a little bit here and see what it's like to manage this in a larger area this year. Maybe because last year you set up manure that you started collecting and now you have a pile, it stayed covered, you're ready to try to spread it. You want to learn a little bit more about like the rate, when's the right time, how do I work through that pile, maybe reserve some equipment from the district to spread my manure, and designing footing. So you know, maybe you've tried a heavy use area and now you want to figure out, well, okay, if I want it here and it's gonna stay here, what do I want it to look like long term? And maybe in the second year, that's when it would make sense to, you've done some soil testing and you're ready to do kind of the first thing. If your pH is low, then maybe it's time to add some lime, and the soil test will help you figure out exactly how much you need to apply to see an impact in your fields. And then year 3 and 4 is, you know, you're starting to figure out how to apply this to all areas of your farm or your homestead. And you're trying to come up with designing more long-term areas for confinement or manure. Maybe you're ready to kind of move on to some more intense steps with weed management or renovation. And hopefully this is just an example of how to make it a little bit more digestible, because it is possible for you all to do it and you don't have to do it in 1 year, and help set kind of realistic goals for you and your family. And the last slide that I want to show is just, there's a great handout that will be in the resources that we share with you at the end. And it's just a pasture management calendar. So the idea is that it's showing you some different activities that you do in different months of the year in our climate. And you know, it talks a little bit about maybe when those different rest periods would happen, how long they would be, different times that make the most sense for spreading manure. You know, maybe it's reseeding areas and when the best time is to do for that, when the best time is to take soil tests. So that's just a great another resource that will be available to you. Yeah, so that, I know that was a lot of information, but I hope that that was really helpful for starting to get to thinking about all of these different pieces of managing your pastures and getting started. Now I'm going to hand it over to Kiana.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. So as we mentioned throughout the presentation, there's a Google Drive folder that we've put together. And this folder has a lot of resources and plans and handouts in it that are going to help provide more in-depth information. So a link to that was just shared in the chat. And it'll also be posted on our website and on Facebook. And it'll be emailed to you if you registered for this workshop. So we also wanted to highlight a couple of the other upcoming online workshops. I know many of you have already signed up for these, but please feel free to do so through the link that's put in the chat as well. So July 28th, we're going to have a workshop called How to Begin Managing Your Livestock Manure. And then in August, it's addressing mud and designing a heavy use area. And then in September, we're hosting a workshop on how to get started implementing a project with TCD. So a link to register for those workshops is also in the chat right now, and it will also be included in the follow-up email. And then if you don't already get our monthly newsletter, it's a great way to get information about upcoming events, and there's lots of fun info in there and cool news stories. So there's a link to that in the chat as well. And then as Nora mentioned in the beginning of the workshop, we offer technical assistance to residents in Thurston County. So we wanted to specifically mention that if you're a landowner in the Middle Deschutes watershed and you have a stream or the Deschutes River running through your property, there may be cost share funding available that match your goals and concerns. This funding from the Department of Ecology covers replanting a wide buffer of native trees and shrubs and fencing along the stream. If you live in another part of the county, have a stream running through your property, and you think you might be interested in something like this, we sometimes have access to other funding sources that provide cost share for these types of habitat projects. So to find out more about site visits or cost share opportunities, feel free to send one of us an email to follow up. And then we apologize for going over time a little bit, but we wanted to make sure that we get any questions from any of you. So at this time, we want to open it up for some questions. So feel free to put any thoughts or questions you have in the comment box, or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions. And just to start, I know that we had one question during the presentation from Dawn, and they asked, what makes clover grow? And so I'm going to hand these kind of questions off to Nora and Nicole, and they'll have some insight for us.
Yeah, clover really likes pH of at least 6, and it really likes initially to have a soil that has some fertility in it, but then once it establishes over at least a season, it starts to be able to produce a lot of its own nitrogen. So then it can, you know, once it gets established, it can really start to take off. And then, like I said, it can outcompete grass. So that's why sometimes you'd see an area that has a lot of it. But if you're interested in getting more of it in your pastures, that's definitely something that you can reseed. Usually when you reseed pastures, it's done in a mix where the mix is only like a max like 8 to 10% with a clover in it. Higher amounts can really be too much rich grass for livestock, and that can cause a lot of bloat and foundering. So yeah, so if you're interested in something like learning more about reseeding, that's something that if you reach out directly to me, I can answer more questions.
Great, and we'll just hang on here to see if there's any more questions. We're here to answer them, so feel free to just write whatever's on your mind in the chat box, or unmute yourself, and we'll try to help you.
I see that new question that Kevin just put in the comments. He said, apps for recommending weeds. One that I've really been using a lot lately that I like for all kinds of different plants is called Seek, S-E-E-K. Another one that you see used a lot is called Picture This. There are a ton, but Seek is one that I've really liked. And sometimes with grass, you have to kind of keep moving around the plant and it'll tell you like exactly what it is, but it's good for grass and for weeds. So that's definitely awesome, because, you know, before that I was just looking at paper and then looking at it, and it's sometimes not always super easy to identify in different stages. But I do have in the resource folder that I think just went out in a link in the chat box, a few different resources for IDing weeds as well too. So definitely. And then, you know, if you ever have one that you're like, man, I just can't figure out what it is, send me an email, and you know, I'll either know right off the bat or I'll ask my team, and it's always a fun scavenger hunt a little bit to figure it out if it's not one that we commonly see, because sometimes we get weeds that come in from our hay that we get from Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon or something like that. So every once in a while we get something real funky.
Great, yeah. Seek, I think it's by iNaturalist, is a great app. So we have another question from Wayne and Kate, and they ask, do you make home visits for recommendations? And yes, we do, and you can feel free to reach out to any of us, and we can kind of let you know how that process works. Nicole or Nora, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that we can only offer that particular service to folks who live in Thurston County, but if you live outside of Thurston County, we're happy to help you connect with your local conservation district who does really similar work to us. And yeah, be in touch. We'll help you fill out what's called a request for assistance and let you know kind of what the timeline on doing something like that is.
And we'll hold on here for a few more minutes and wait for any additional questions. We really appreciate y'all joining us tonight. It was fun to get to interact with you all and hear a little bit about your different situations that you have on your property. Hi, Wendy. You asked if you'll be able to view this talk later, and the answer to that is yes, we recorded it. So it's going to go out in an email probably tomorrow. It'll also be on our website and on Facebook. So you can make sure that you can rewatch it. We have a question from Jay Kendall. Why do you cover the manure?
The biggest reason we cover manure is water quality, because especially here, I think, Jay Kendall, I saw you live in Spokane, so your water situation may be a bit different, but here in particular, water quality is one of the biggest concerns for covering manure. It also helps in the composting process. So if you are looking to use your manure on your pastures as part of that pasture renovation that Nicole's been talking about, helping that composting process along will make that possible and get it up to the right temperature so that weed seeds and any pathogens will die off before you spread it. It'll make it into a spreadable material. So we are doing, like Kiana mentioned, we do have an upcoming workshop that's on manure management specifically, and we'll kind of talk about the different scales of that, from just covering your pile, which might be what is the most accessible, to like bigger engineered manure management structures that can really speed up that process if you have a large number of animals too. Yeah, definitely helps with composting and water quality in particular. Dave, your question, will my thin sparse, could you elaborate on what that question means a little bit, Dave?
You can also unmute your mic, Dave, if you want to say your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that I don't think that's something to necessarily be concerned about. I mean, I think there's some considerations there, but if you've had weeds that have been going to seed for years, unfortunately, like a lot of those weed seeds stay in your soil for a very, very long time. So that's why some of these other techniques can really be, the best way to get rid of those weeds is really thinking about some of those grazing management practices, and then maybe some specific things like mowing. If you have a ton of a weed that just went to seed on the surface and it's bare, I would say that that's probably going to be the time that like you're maybe would be at all concerned with that. But in general, harrowing is going to do so many good things for creating like just actually increasing your grasses, like it stimulates grass growth, and that's going to make a much more denser stand, and it's kind of part of this whole like systems thinking. So the benefits are going to outweigh any of that, and then it's really, once you kind of get a system in place, you're already doing so many other things to reduce that weed seed bank that you know it's really that the positives are going to outweigh that so much.
It looks like Dave's question came in. He says, my grass is new last fall and thin. Will the grass reseed itself and thicken it up?
Yeah, Dave, that actually might be a helpful thing for like me and you to talk about at a different time, because there might be some other things going on. If you know, it depends on how you reseeded, whether you had a bare area or you just reseeded over a pasture. And there could have been some issues with germination and establishment based on like the nutrients that are in your soil, or maybe what the pH is, or some of those pieces. So if it's relatively bare and you're really concerned about that, then there might be some other approaches to take to kind of jumpstart that growth. But if in general you have a pasture that's more thin and you're trying to manage for the type of grasses that you want there are a lot of the practices that we talked tonight that will help really stimulate that grass growth and let it outcompete some of the things we don't want and help it thicken up. But in your case, thinking about doing like a soil test could be really helpful. So yeah, if you want to reach out to one of us to kind of follow up about that probably would be great.
Jay Kendall said, I have been allowing grasses to go to seed to allow reseeding. Therefore, I never thought about mowing. Is that off? Question mark. So maybe Nicole, do you have an answer to that?
I guess that there's not necessarily something wrong with letting grasses that you want to be there go to seed. However, when we let things stay in that, like go all the way to that like reproductive stage and like senesce, which means they start to like, you know, all the part above ground does start to die, then we are not going to get maybe the highest production that we want in that field. But the seed that does drop from the grasses that you do want will help, and you know they will establish if you know other conditions are right for them. But what I like about mowing is that instead of potentially, you know, letting the good grasses go to seed, you're actually preventing the bad grasses and the weeds from not going to seed. So again, I think that mowing can be really helpful for getting some of those things back in control in the way you want them to be.
I see Dave asked, I'm outside the county in Grays Harbor. Do they have a similar program there? Yes, Dave, there is a Grays Harbor Conservation District. And if you email me, Nora, and the second email there directly, I will put you in touch with some awesome folks who work at Grays Harbor CD.
But in terms of our soil testing program, Dave, if you wanted to use our soil testing program, anybody can use that.
That's true, yeah.
So I just want to put that out there too. I'm not 100% familiar with if Grays Harbor has the soil testing, but they absolutely have good farm technical assistance.
If anyone else has other questions, I would really encourage you to get in touch with us one-on-one. A lot of our work is around working with people one-on-one and is really built on having these relationships and learning more about what you're doing. So please feel free to reach out to us directly. We love getting to hear about what your projects are and welcome those conversations. So we've gone over time a bit. I want to respect everybody's time this evening. If you have questions, like I say, please reach out. And as Kiana shared, this has been recorded and all of these links and everything will be sent out to you in an email tomorrow, whichever email you registered for this with, and it'll be shared online as well. So thank you so much. We'll sign off for the evening and I'll be in touch with you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.